Sal, thanks for being here.
I'm super excited to be here. I can't wait to have a long and fruitful conversation about AI and legal.
Yeah, it should be really interesting. You want to give a quick intro, a quick rundown?
Sure. I'm Sal Carranza. I was a practicing lawyer for 17 years. I still have my license. I worked in very large law firms, very small law firms, started and exited out of a small law firm. And now I build stuff. So in the legal space, that might be startups, it might be consulting for legal departments, sometimes law firms on how to use AI, how to think about software, how to buy software. And I just generally try to help others in the legal space achieve their goals and impact the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we're gonna get into AI and CLEs and AI and legal kind of later on, but this question just came to me now. I don't think we ever really talked about in depth about your transition out of practicing law and moving more into entrepreneurship and what was that like?
Yeah, so let me take a step back. So I'm a big believer that the moment we're in right now, and I'm not talking from like a Sam Altman AGI dystopian perspective. I just mean simply, I believe this is another wave, just like we had with like the first version of the internet and PCs before it and the like. And at every instance of a wave, you get this sort of early adopter portion of the world, and then you slowly add on that, right? And I think now, though, this version of it is very much about agency. And what I mean by that is that we're getting tools that allow you to do way more on your own than you could before. And I think the best way to unlock that opportunity is by being more entrepreneurial. I don't mean necessarily starting your own law firm or your own business or anything like that. I just mean thinking how entrepreneurs think, which is willing to take a little bit of risk, even if you know or if it does fail, because what you get out of it is a learning experience. And that perfect flywheel is how you improve and learn. And it's actually the perfect way to get better at using these AI tools is trying and experimenting. And so, why do I say that in the beginning? Well, when I was a practicing lawyer, I worked my way up, I made partner. I, in many ways, liked practicing law sometimes, but a lot of the times it just wasn't for me. And part of that was that practicing as a lawyer tends to be very much about the way it's always been done and precedent and making sure you follow what the precedent says, because that's what can be a repeatable act and understanding for the businesses and the like, right? Plus the incentive structures of billing hours, being a lawyer, it's a tough gig, even if you like being a lawyer, in my opinion. But I did that for a long time. And then I left to go do management consulting of sorts, kind of a lawyer hybrid at a company called Elevate, and I really enjoyed it. And it was the first time I got the opportunity to really start being more entrepreneurial, thinking more about experimentation, trying things, and using technology the way I've always had, but in a setting where people let me embrace that opportunity. And that really led me from being a practicing lawyer to where I am today, because when I left that job to start my own firm, I realized I could do it on my own. And then once I went to start my own firm, which was a hybrid practicing law with technology built on top of it, I really looked at it as an opportunity to do what I really enjoy, the passion I have, what really enjoy spending time on, which was software and building and experimenting and learning. And so that was the transition for me over time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to talk about this word agency because I think both in software and with people, if you can start to look at the correlation in what and how the word agency applies to people and how it applies to software, it gives a lot better context to people as AI agents are kind of being thrown around a lot. People talk about a lot of different agentic workflows and that kind of stuff. But if we could kind of dig into that word agency, what it means to you for and when it applies to people, and then also if you could kind of talk about agency and agentic, systems when we talk about AI and software.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're correlated in some ways, and in others they're not, right? And so I think at a starting point, when I talk about agency, what people have heard me talk about as kind of doers is there are people who naturally, when are presented a task or a problem, go out of their way to make every effort to do it on their own without really asking anybody. They'll experiment, they'll try, even if they have no idea what to do with it, right? Or they will go above and beyond their quote unquote role in their company. They just naturally have that. And that's related to high agency, meaning I am owning that task. I'm willing to go do it, even if nobody's necessarily told me to do it, right? Not everybody's like that. A lot of people require somebody to tell them, I need you to do this task. And then when you're done with that task, you can do the next one. And they need that forward movement in how they work and how they operate. The high agency people tend to be the people that move things forward at a faster clip. Yes, sometimes they break things, sometimes it doesn't go so well, but they learn and they move and they go forward. And that's why I talk about agency and high agency in this age as being something that's really important to start getting better at, which is being willing to try and experiment is part of being a high agency person. It doesn't mean you don't ask questions at
Yeah.
some point. It doesn't mean you don't learn through others. It just means you're more likely to move forward. In the inverse, what does that mean for the agent space, right? Again, if you follow along at all, we are being inundated with information. A lot of it is marketing
Yeah.
from AI companies, legal tech companies on what is next and what is coming. In a lot of ways, that is good. It's good to push the boundaries. The legal industry has needed that for a really long time. But in some ways, and in a lot of other ways, it's not great for the average consumer, the average lawyer, whoever it might be, because it's really hard to understand what is real and what they're talking about. So if you think at its most basic level of how you interact with AI now, for the most part, it's very user driven. So I have a question, I prompt a chat bot or some sort of platform that has that in the background,
Yeah.
and it gives me an answer. Maybe you're now connecting it to your various documents in your DMS or the web to do searches or legal research. And then maybe that output is getting created and put into some sort of document, right? And created. That very small window is an agent kind of idea, a workflow. What's interesting is that for a long time we've had workflows built into tools. I mean, this is not new, right? You manually set a process through a software tool. I want this thing to start. When that's done, I go to the next thing. When that's done, I go to the next thing. Sometimes things run in parallel, but it's a workflow. You can layer in a large language model in the background on any of those pieces to do some of the generative AI work or you know, reviewing unstructured data, getting reports, whatever it might be. But fundamentally, it's still a workflow. What you're really hearing more and more people talk about, and this is kind of how it correlates back to what I said in the beginning, is an a true agent. It's called kind of like a React agent. Is something that independently is making reasoning decisions, reason, evaluate, right? React on what it needs to do without your input. That's a very different thing, right? Humans do that. Having an agent do that is a different problem altogether. And for the end user, what does that mean? Well, it can mean that while you can design a workflow and you can layer in a large language model to do parts and pieces, if the workflow breaks at some point, it stops, right? Well, a true agent, an independent thinking agent, when it stops, it won't, or when it gets stuck, it won't just stop. It'll try another thing. It'll work like a human. Well, what if I try this? What if I try this? And it keeps going, sometimes in a loop forever, and other times it figures out a new way to do it. This is also something that's been being discussed right now is this idea that large language models, generative AI, big AI, kind of in a big circle, will just do things differently than humans, and so that what looks like it's doing something that is doesn't make any sense because you wouldn't do it that way, it
Yep.
has succeeded in that, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And why do I say all that? Because that is how everything is moving, and the idea is that you will have these agents working independently of lawyers
Mhm.
or people doing things,
Yep.
reviewing an email and sending a response, taking an intake form from a new client and creating a whole set of documents, reviewing discovery and independently deciding what is valuable and not valuable, and then using it to do something, right?
Yep.
That's kind of what the agent plan looks like, in a very kind of basic, way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to have this discussion about the best way for a computer to do something is not always the best way for a human to do something because we have different capabilities. So I don't know if are you into chess at all?
I am not good at chess,
Yeah.
but I have played my whole life. So yes, I understand, but I go ahead.
But you know the story of Deep Blue and Kasparov then in the 90s. And Deep Blue was a AI engine that beat Gary Kasparov, who was, one of the best chess players of all time and beat Gary Kasparov in chess. It was a big deal. But the essentially what if you look at the objective best way to play a chess game would be to memorize every game ever played and then every single position, consider every possible move and evaluate, the best move based on the historical precedent, but also like evaluating all the next possible moves, right? But a human can't do that, not in any realistic time frame, because we would run out of brain power. It would take too much time. Like the human can't do that. So when you play chess, you kind of have to rely on intuition and some memory stuff and things that we don't really fully understand. But a computer has that capability to be able to run through and actually check every single move and evaluate which move is best based on that, based on checking every single move and going over every single move because they're a lot faster than we are, right? So that means for a computer, the best way to do it maybe that objective best way of checking every single move, whereas for a human, it may not be. But I think the the interesting part is when you think about that in other scenarios, in other fields. I think you read that article also, the Bitter Truth article.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting article, but it's kind of like the way I see it is that the overall premise is if you can give a computer a definite objective and definite parameters to evaluate the success of that objective, and then you can just give it a ton of examples and you just feed it, a ton of data and a ton of examples, then it may come up with exactly what you're saying, a better way of doing it or a different way of doing it than the way that, we have done it historically.
Yeah, what's interesting is the chess example or AlphaGo is another example. With AlphaGo, they let the AI teach itself. So
Yeah.
it didn't memorize every possible pattern. It just taught itself. And that is more where we're going because part of the deal is that the in anything you do, human or computer, there is sort of an optimal way to do it for who's ever doing that thing. And what might be obvious to us is not obvious to a computer, especially one that you haven't taught anything to or
Yeah.
followed a pattern. And what might be obvious to us as meaning I can't do that. I'm human. I physically can't do that.
Yeah.
Computer has none of that restrictions, right? So they just might do something totally different. And I think that is part of the compute factor. How do you let you sort of models, algorithms make decisions to move forward? Now, there's a lot of societal questions on that, and that's kind of a separate question. But I think the fundamental underlying piece of this is that in anything, if you come at it from a first principles perspective, if you break it down and really try to go through and evaluate why you're doing something or not, you oftentimes come up with better options, different options, right? If you're stuck on this is the way we've always done it and this is the way we're going to do it, it's very difficult to innovate, to try new things. Computers, if you let them, they have none of that sort of like past baggage, right? Which is again why a good example of this in kind of how we've progressed is self-driving cars, right? I mean, the first version of these was the idea of chess, right? Like give it every possible existence ever so it can see and know, and then it will make decisions, right? And then they started to realize that that's kind of impossible and that's not how humans work. And so we just started letting it make its own quote unquote decisions based on an algorithm, right? A neural network instantly on device on your car, right? Yes, it's getting a bunch of data, but just like our eyes are, our brain is, and then it makes a decision. And I think that is much more likely where things are going. I don't know if we'll get there. There's real caps on ability to do some of this stuff that we haven't totally figured out yet. Again, regardless of all the marketing,
Yeah.
there's compute issues, there's cost issues, there's data center size, there's water issues, there's like all this other stuff. But it is from a sort of abstract perspective amazing.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's important to think about privacy and security and societal issues in the big picture. And there's lots of smart people thinking about that. But just purely from a technical standpoint, it's amazing how this stuff works.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, we could go down the theory rabbit hole for a long time and talk about a lot of abstract ideas, probably all day. But I do want to kind of bring it back to in a practical sense for entrepreneurs and also for lawyers, how we can start to think about um, the best way to leverage AI use cases. Another thing to talk about is like LLMs are really meant to be used programmatically, right? They're really tools for developers to build better applications. There's a lot of functionality that you can only get accessing LLMs via API that you don't get interacting with just the chat interface. I think another thing is like there's debate about is AI actually thinking or is it just a stochastic system that's just, guessing over token distribution. So there's that. But I think a lot of that stuff is irrelevant if you are an entrepreneur, if you're a lawyer and you're thinking about, well, how do I take this tool as it is today and start to use it in a practical sense. So I want to get into that a little bit.
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. I would say a couple things to note. I'm all for thinking about the practical use case and not worrying so much about how does everything work before I use it. The thing I've been saying for 3 years is you, random human, 99% of people have no idea how their car works, and it's a computer, right? It is not the 1905 Model T, right? This is a computer, and you fundamentally do not understand what is going on in the background with all the chips and communications. You just know you put your foot on a pedal, or you put your foot on this brake, it goes, it stops, you turn, right? I mean, again, people think, oh, if I turn, it's got to be pulling like a cable. No, it's just data signals, right? I mean, maybe old cars, but my point is that you're okay with that, but that's because we've built a bunch of guardrails and structure around what that is. I think the interesting thing about where we are with the current AI tooling and models is that if we fundamentally want to be able to trust it to do things that are more futuristic, make its own decisions, move through the process, we want to build trust. And it's hard to build trust when you have no idea why it's doing what it's doing, right? And I don't even mean it from the perspective of closed source models, meaning a company owns the weights and biases of how it's made. So OpenAI, Claude, whatever, versus open source models, which you can see everything. Put that to the side. I just mean fundamentally how it works, right? Why did, when you asked it a question, did it give you the output it did? Is it just simply it found the most probable next token, letter, word section, or was there more fundamentally going on? What's interesting is there Anthropic, who has built the Claude chatbot that a lot of people know, has been putting out a lot of interesting research about how large language models think and tracing features to kind of work through. And I think it's been interesting to watch because as the large language model makes a decision, it's not doing the path that I think everybody expected always. But what's interesting about it is part of the reason sometimes it gets maybe something wrong or not what you expected is that by tracing the output, you can see it never got to the document you think it needed to look at, or the law it needed to look at, or it just never looked at it.
Yeah.
It's not that it just ignored it. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it never looks at it. But knowing it never looked at it, or knowing it ignored it, is helpful in evaluating the output so you can have trust in that tool. So I think trust is still a really big deal. That being said, it's not a reason not to use the tools, because everything right now is still with a human in the loop. There's still people involved in reviewing the documentation, providing the advising and counsel, whatever it might be. And there's also ways to do it that are less risk, right? So having it draft your motion and filing it in court and not reviewing it and getting sanctioned because you didn't check the case law, that's not an AI problem. That's a you problem, right?
Yeah.
That's a you didn't do your job, but it shows you about that kind of agency part of letting it do everything without any sort of guardrails. You can also use it on less risk stuff, right? You could use it on administrative things in your firm or your company. You can have it just help brainstorm. You can talk to it. You can have it summarize documentation, although summarize sometimes is also an interesting question, because why did it summarize what it did, right? If you think about when you read a book, there's all this nuance in a book, in a whole book. If you simply read the cliff notes, right, the shortened version of it, you miss a lot of that nuance, that context, and I think that's an important thing to think about. But to your broader question, I think anybody can get started pretty simply these days, and I've also been pushing this a lot. I don't think people understand that with any software and really with any skill, the sooner you start, your skill compounds over time. And so saying I'm just going to wait, which is what lawyers generally do, and I'll figure it out later, and or I'll just wait till the software gets great and I'll just get handed software and I'll be able to use it. That's fine in theory, but what if we are in an age where being able to leverage these tools is not just on the end model provider or software provider, it's also on you on learning how to do that. Plus, the better you get at using these tools, you can better make better buying decisions. You can understand why things work they do and where they work and how they can fit into your practice, your law firm, your company, whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of decision making here that people are just handing off to others when they should have more agency about learning some of the ways these tools work. And you can do that, right? There's YouTube videos and people like you out there showing people how to do stuff. But I think if you start, you can go. I will say one thing that I've learned over the last 3 years is that doing a quote unquote proof of concept, meaning a small idea in the beginning to test and learn, is great. But don't think too small in how you use some of this stuff, because for the most part, the same problems you're going to deal with on a large scale problem are the same problems you deal on a small scale problem. And so the return on your investment on a small scale problem maybe isn't going to be worth your time versus a big, more complicated problem. It really will. And so, again, part of this is finding the right partners to help you work through things and thinking more broadly. And I don't mean you have to be the, AmLaw 100 or AmLaw 50 who's got billions of dollars and is buying, the $100,000 Harvey platforms. It can be a one person law firm where you're just thinking about why you might want to use software to give you the time to think more strategically or to get your documentation out or your invoices out faster or whatever it might be. There's lots of opportunities there across the spectrum.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to touch on there. The one of the things is, I mean, the sooner that you can delegate your admin work in some capacity, the sooner you can get to and focus on doing what you're best at. I think also there's something else you're touching on is that we're hitting almost like a form of technological parity because we have whether you're a very big law firm and you buy Harvey's, platform or you're a small law firm, everyone basically has access to the same language models, right? And even there's the democratization of data even in the legal field, right? We have, different ways of now being able to get different information about different cases and that kind of stuff also, right? So there's in that sense, things are becoming a lot more, the playing field is becoming a lot more equal. And I think exactly what you're saying, people who are more aggressive and tech forward and take the initiative to try to take advantage of these tools and build their own solutions will definitely see a much bigger advantage. I also want to touch on the point where you talked about the safer ways to get started with using these things, right? Because obviously the most risky thing you could do is have AI do things that are high risk for your firm and that you're gonna have to show to the that are outward facing, right? And so Microsoft actually has a framework for this called the crawl, walk, run framework, where it's crawl is, you start using AI internally for, internal task, administrative task inside of your business, inside of your firm. Everything has a human in the loop. Walking is you start to take the human out of the loop a little bit, still focusing more on internal tasks, testing things out with things that are outward facing, and then running obviously is where you have like a full sprint would be, you've built out systems and workflows that have almost very little human interaction, and you're doing inward facing tasks and also outward facing tasks. So there's that piece as well. I think what you're talking about now segues nicely into a question that I wanted to ask you from the beginning of the podcast, which is what is, in your opinion, what is wrong with current AI CLEs?
Huh. So let me touch on one thing that you said there because I think it's important, and then we can talk about the state of legal training right now. I think that when you are thinking through how lawyers work, they're fundamentally input driven profession right now. What does that mean? Well, the vast majority of lawyers get paid billing in 6-minute increments, right? So as they spend time on a client, they bill their time and that's how they get paid. So for a lot of lawyers, especially in small law firms, but even in large law firms, you get this classic paradox, which is I'm so busy, I don't have the time to learn software that might benefit me. Or the inverse, which is why would I want software that reduces the amount of time I can bill? And so you get these weird incentives that make it difficult to get adoption on software. But I think the reason I bring it up, not going to get into the whole, you know, is that good for legal profession or not? Whatever, right? I don't want to get into a discussion about the billable hour, but I do think what's important about that is lawyers are sort of very poor at thinking in systems. They tend to think in silos about themselves. So, why would I spend 5 hours automating a process that takes me 40 minutes? Right? That doesn't make any sense. Well, the reason is that if you think in systems, that 5 hours that you spent 40 minutes for that 40-minute process, you never have to do again. And now you can scale that over time and you get a net benefit that is much more than the 40 minutes of time saving. And so I think thinking in systems is really important in this next age of how you work. And that can be across the board from admin to the actual practice of law so that you get more repeated output that you can scale. So that's the first thing.
Yep.
Why do I start with that? I think that is part of the problem with training for lawyers right now. We have been trained from law school all the way through continuing, and a CLE, right? If you're not a lawyer, is a continuing legal education. Every profession has some version of it, right? They want you to stay on top of your expertise, right? So that if anybody is hiring you to do something, they can understand that you have spent the time to learn, right? Those CLEs cover everything that you can imagine in practicing law, including some of the business of law stuff, which is things like sending out a purchase order, an invoice, uh, tracking your time, how to use a trust account, all those kinds of things, right? What is very lacking in a lot of that training is practical application of how to use software and when to use software. And that is often because, in my experience, the bar associations that decide what is allowed for a CLE will push you, the CLE provider, to make it focused on the individual practice of law or that individual thing tied to how you run a law firm and less about a broader practical how I might use this generally in a business. And so if you don't focus enough on the legal practice per se, you can't get a CLE, right? It's not universally true, but it is more difficult. And so in this age we're in where a lot of these tooling software problems, models, the rest of it are getting built into legal tech, we seem to be missing an opportunity to help legal professionals. Could be lawyers, paralegals, legal operations people, whoever it might be, better understand how all these systems work, regardless of whether you get a CLE for it, because I think it's going to be an important part of just being a practical, useful professional as we progress.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. And I think kind of drawing a parallel from the legal field to other fields and other spaces, like for example, in the agency space, if you're somebody like me that builds custom solutions, or if you have a marketing agency, the idea is that for a period of time you sell your time, right? Which is kind of what lawyers do, is they sell their time. But the larger idea is that in selling your time, at some point you will progress to having an understanding that will allow you to either sell information or sell a product, right? Something that allows you to dissociate your inputs and your outputs, right? Because obviously time can only scale so much. And so when you think about in other fields, from a business standpoint, you want to get to a position where you can dissociate your inputs and outputs as quickly as possible. Um, do you see that happening in the legal field, or what do you see as what's the main obstacle to that in the legal field, and what's the attachment to the billable hour in legal?
That's a fundamentally long conversation. I think from my perspective, it's just a matter of it's kind of how it's always been done.
Yeah,
And I shouldn't say that. It wasn't done like this 80 years ago, right? This is kind of a new phenomenon in this version of the legal field. But my broader point is that lawyers get paid on inputs and they fundamentally understand it's very simple. They've been taught it. And the buyers tend to be people who used to be in law firms. And so those two collide and it's easy to understand. The buyers complaining about it endlessly, right? I'm getting overcharged. It's too expensive. I won't even use a lawyer because it's too expensive. I can't possibly make that phone call because I'm going to get charged, you know, $58 for like a 3-minute conversation. And I can't do it, but it's how everybody has always seen it, right? And we've had people push for alternative fee agreements, different ways of billing your time, of selling your time for a long time. And you get pushback again because not just lawyers, people generally don't like change. They know what they know, and it's hard for them to fathom that there's another way. The problem with that is that if software is eating the world, right, as has been said, and I think it is,
yeah,
you get in this conflict, which is that if the software can do this in 40 seconds, 5 minutes, whatever it might be, I can't bill 17 hours for that.
right,
And so where am I going to make money? How am I going to serve my customers? Well, what's interesting about that is that if you sell an output, right? Instead of selling an input, the time you enter, but an output, the value is tied to the output. And as long as you are both transparent in what that is, meaning, hey, you would like me to draft a complaint, you would like me to draft a demand letter, you would like me to respond to something, whatever it might be, it will cost X,
right,
$100, $1,500, $20,000, whatever it is. Then it reverts to you, the creator of the output, to properly manage your business as efficiency as you can and maximize productivity so that you gain as much profit on that output that you've created. And now your incentives are all of a sudden aligned.
yep,
Again, transparency, understanding is very important, but fundamentally that removes your restriction on how much time you can spend, because if you get really good at developing a product that you can do in 40 minutes that you charge 10,000 for, and the client is totally happy with it because the value tied to that is amazing, then you're great. Part of the problem here though is also that the bar associations are very slow to change. And so you have a lot of ethical guidelines that say things like well, you can't charge an usury amount of money to a client for something. And so you get a little bit in this box, which is like, well, it only took me 5 minutes to create it, and I'm charging $50,000.
Yeah.
And somebody might say, I mean, that's not fair. And you might say, well, let's look at the value of it, right? Okay, so this thing I'm giving you, I'm charging you $50,000, but it's worth to you in your business 200,000, 400,000, a million, whatever it might be. Now you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, the value is actually really good, man. That client, that business is getting a great deal. They spent 50 grand and they got the value of $1 million or whatever it might be, right? And you can understand why it's totally fine in how you sell that time, but you have to change your frame. And I think what's happening is for a long time, there wasn't anything that was truly pushing up against selling your input. Now we have this tool that you type in and it generates all on its own. Sometimes it's not very good, sometimes it's amazing, but whatever, an output. And so it's forcing the legal industry, law firms, lawyers to rethink how they sell their value. And fundamentally, that's the thing I always talk about is that if you change your perspective to selling your value, the whole world is your oyster. If your value is tied to the amount of input you put in, right? By how many minutes you charge, you're going to restrict your own compensation, but you're also fundamentally stuck in a loop that is very hard to get out of, right? And so I think for me, the thing I just always say anybody who's ever or who's trying to think about this in a different way is that yes, it can be a little scary for change. Yes, you have to be transparent and think through what you charge and why. But fundamentally, no matter what, businesses, buyers of legal services, they're looking for an outcome. They're not looking maybe there's one or two situations I can think of, but for the most part, they're not looking for you to spend 1,000 hours on something. That's not why they are paying for it. They want the outcome you're giving them. As long as you give them a really good outcome with really great and I shouldn't say outcome is in a result per se, like I'm going to win this trial, but instead, like I'm going to give you a representation with this work product. The work I do show you the value. You're fine, and that will open up tons of opportunities for you. Whether you're somebody like you, who's building an agency or you're a law firm who's got 1,000 clients, it's the same, right? And it actually offers, I mean, I think almost always you'll get more profit, more revenue because guess what? You'll have time to do more work. It's just how it is.
Yeah, completely, completely. I mean, because for as long as you sell your time, the most valuable asset in your business is going to be your hour and your time. And as I'm kind of being a dead horse at this point, but the quicker that you can make the most valuable asset that you're selling, not your time and something else, one, you give yourself the opportunity to scale a lot more. Two, there's also quality of life, right? Because if the only way you can make more money is raise your rates a bit or work more hours, then obviously there's a conflict there with quality of life to some point, to some extent.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think something I always try to talk about is forget the billable hour or the alternative fee and that whole fight. Just simply look at it from the perspective of do I want to make as much money or more money that I make now? And do I want to have more ability to spend it where I want to? That could be on more strategy for your client. It could be on taking on more clients. It could just mean I want to spend time with my family, my kids. I want to go on a trip, whatever it might be. I think one of the fundamental things that's happening is with the new set of software, we are seeing a compression on how many people are required to create things, right? And so if you're a law firm owner, right, and you have some sort of skill set, right, whatever it might be, and you have clients that you service, the only way you could scale that before was hiring more people, right? You had to hire more associates. That was your software. A junior was your software. You use the junior, you spend it, you take more of that junior's uh, output than you paid them, and that's how you scaled. Now you have this opportunity to scale with software without having to hire as many people. I think you still need to hire some people, but less people, which gives you the business owner a lot of opportunities you didn't have before. And to your point, it lets you play in a space you couldn't before. You might be able to get that really large client on that really big case where before they would have only gone to a gigantic law firm. Why? Well, you can prove to them, you can show them, hey, I have built a system that allows me and maybe a few team members to do the same work as that giant law firm, and I can give you incredible work product. I can
Yeah.
still do it. That is fundamentally a very big change, and I think it's a huge opportunity for smaller law firms to really start making a dent in quote unquote big law in how they work if they can show the end user, the buyer, that they can deliver on that promise.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And I mean it's a form of leverage at the end of the day, right? It's figuring out how do you get more outputs from your inputs. And I think I've had some interesting conversations about this, but I think the intersection where if you're a knowledge worker, or if you're someone who is providing a service or building a product, the intersection where you start to find the most leverage for yourself is figuring out how digital workers interact with tools, right? So I'll give you an example for myself. As you know, with me, most of my stuff I build out is in 8N, right? Um, Over the weekend, I was able to get MCP set up for N8N on Claude Desktop, which I'd been meaning to do for a while, but I just got around to doing it this weekend. And so I've been playing around with it, building out some really basic workflows with it. But that's the intersection of you. Obviously, you have the language model, which is Claude, right? The brain. But then MCP is that protocol, that standard that allows it to now interact with my work environment, which is N8N, and actually do things in that work environment for me. And so figuring out not just, which is comes back to my point again that I made earlier, which is that LLMs are most valuable when they are being used programmatically in some way, right? Not just in a normal interface of, asking questions and chatting and that kind of stuff. There's some value to that, but the real value is going to be figuring out, well, how do I connect this, what is essentially a digital worker, to my workspace and my work environment, right? So for somebody like me that's building things out in a workflow builder, if I can get Claude to start building some of those projects for me, that then increases my capacity a lot. And then this also ties into what I want to ask you about in terms of we already talked a little bit about AI CLEs, but also I want to talk about what's the value for a domain expert, someone that's a lawyer that has experience in law, to build their own tools, or at least to understand how to build their own tools versus just buying, tools and software out of the box from your perspective.
So fundamentally, since software came about, there's always been a buy or build question for any business owner, right? And up until very recently, for the most part, unless you were a very large organization, the answer was always buy because software development is expensive. You don't have that expertise. And so you went and bought something. The problem with that is that when you bought a SaaS tool, right? They presented to you whatever workflow they had created in their SaaS tool, whatever product was there. So you end up either having to change how you work for that tool, or you end up with tool sprawl. You have 17 different SaaS products that do a slightly different thing because you need it, and you try to learn in those systems. And universally, the vast majority of people never actually learn how to properly use any of the tools they buy because there are 100 features and they don't know what to do. And so they use the one thing and they either are happy with that because it's great, or they complain. And it's, the classic, like, I can't do this. Your product is broken. And well, no, you just didn't learn how to use it. Right. And that's been a big problem across anybody who's trying to make a decision on what to buy. Where we are different now is that what you're starting to see is with a large language model, you can ask it to build something. Why? Well, it can code its own software to design whatever you've been asked. A dashboard, for instance. I want to, extract this data from a PDF and put it into a spreadsheet. Whatever it might be, it can use its programmatic skills to develop that for you, right? And so the question of buy or build is starting to get merged together in, yes, I think there's still a lot of opportunity for the application layer for people to build on top of all these models and give you sophisticated workflows. But I think we're also getting to a place where if you have domain expertise, could be any domain expertise. We'll take lawyers because that's where we generally work. You have a bunch of stuff in your head that oftentimes nobody else knows.
Right.
And it's not often something amazing, Einstein level knowledge. It's just fundamentally, I know that because I've done this 1,000 times, that I click that button and not that button, even though everybody tells me I'm supposed to click that button, right? That is part of this thing that is hidden knowledge in every knowledge worker on earth. You know whole bunches of things that aren't presented in software. That domain expertise tied to a tool, as you said, your own worker, in this case, a software developer that can help you develop something that you know specifically is a step change to anything we've had before. And I'm not the only one that says this. I think everybody has seen where this is going. There's lots of tooling out there, whether it's Lovable or Replete or the rest of it. It's getting better and better. Now you can even do it inside of Claude. You can do it inside of ChatGPT, where it'll just build it there. Now there's platforms that'll help you get further along, right? Because they have different system prompts and tooling and ability to help you get further. But for a total novice, you can get pretty far, way farther than you could before. And I think that's an unlock for a lot of people. They don't even know that exists.
Yeah.
And so, from a domain expertise, making that decision is important. Why did I give that context? Well, you're getting a lot of stuff right now, which is everything is moving so fast. So, I'm just going to wait. Just going to wait. In most situations, I think that's a reasonable perspective. The problem with it is that the longer you wait, the further behind you get in fundamentally understanding how these tooling systems work. Are we gonna get to the point where you can just, you know, open your phone and say, "Hey, ChatGPT, I need you to build me a house,"
Yeah.
and it just builds a house for you? Maybe, I don't know, but I don't think we're gonna get there in the next 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, and so you have this window where you have to start learning. How do you do that? Well, one version of that is there's lots of software tools. Every company that has done this stuff has started to create learning modules, AWS, IBM, ChatGPT, where you can go through the courses and learn at a high level. The issue is that all of them are geared towards you using their product, how to better prompt in their product, how to better leverage connectors in their product. Again, great if you're using their product, but it doesn't fundamentally help you understand how to buy software or how to better use software or make a decision that you're going to build something yourself. And so one of the things that I've been advocating is that, and by the way, it's not just me, very famous people, including people like Mark Cuban, have talked about this over the last 6 to 8 weeks, which is spending time experimenting and learning how AI works is the fundamental unlock of the next 10 years. Even if the tooling progresses as much as they say, even if the models progress as much as they say, better understanding why you structure a prompt the way you do, how to communicate to a model in a way that is beneficial, how to fundamentally do things like when it spits out the code to create you the dashboard, understanding how code is structured. Oh, why? I know that that dependency doesn't work under this. And so I know that's messed up, right? And so you can rework with it, I think is part of the conversation we have to have start with lawyers. And I know that can sound, and I shouldn't say just lawyers, paralegals, legal professionals, whoever it might be. I know that can be scary for people that are non-technical, but I think we are at a point where if you want to quote unquote future proof yourself or improve your position as your career progresses, you need to start learning some of the basic architecture of how software works and how these language models work so that you can just make better decisions. Fundamentally, that's your job is to do it in the most productive, efficient manner you can so that you can make better decisions for your clients. And part of that now, I think, is you're going to have to start to find some time to level up your skills.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. Because one on the one hand, the barrier to entry is lowering, right? It's easier and easier to build now. I think also fundamentally there's some conflict of interest between between SaaS and buyers. And when I say that, I mean that the idea of a SaaS or a software product, even me as someone that kind of builds different things that I'd like to productize and sell, is that as a builder, I would want to build one thing that works for a lot of different people, right? That, it's the same exact thing, and I'm going to sell it to a bunch of different people, and they're all going to use it, and it's going to do enough for them, as it comes out of the box, right? The idea is not for me to customize and personalize that much. But I think as the barrier to entry lowers, I think as people get more and more comfortable with these tools and building becomes easier and easier, I think we hit like a threshold to where it doesn't to where the benefit that you get from an out of the box solution is just not worth it when it's so easy for you to build your own things. And the return that you get from building your own things is so much higher than the return you would get from using a solution out of the box, I think.
Yeah, I think we're also in a moment where there's so much money being thrown into AI that the cost to use it is essentially 0.
Yeah.
You can get free access to lots and lots of different tooling. ChatGPT is completely free for the base model, right? If you wait, it's just gonna get more expensive. It will, I don't care what anybody says, they have to make their money back, this is how it works, and you might as well start learning now because most of this is about experimentation. You have to try to see how the output gets generated. Oh, if I tweak this wording, if I tweak the structure here, if I ask it this kind of question, I get different output. If I use the model in a different way, I get different output. That'll help you better use the tooling. I think one of the disconnects right now is that you get people who say, "Oh, I've tried AI. It doesn't work. I don't like it. It's a waste of time." And then you get other people who are like, mind blown. Like, what are you talking about? It is incredible. And what is the disconnect there? It's pretty simple. On one side, you have people who've really spent the time to use it and have been okay with it failing over and over and over and over and over for a lot of times until they start seeing the benefit. Again, systems thinking. They're willing to put in the time for the later leveraged output versus people who have tried it 5 times, asked it basic questions, and it's like, "This is no good. I don't want to try it anymore."
Yeah.
And again, that's part of this change in how we are using software. I think the first version of I tried it, it didn't work so well was totally valid because you couldn't really do anything about it. It was handed to you. This is the system it was. Somebody's gonna have to go code more features or do something for it to work for you.
Yeah.
That's not how these systems work, and experimentation is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree completely. And then what would you say? So if a lawyer wants to get into this, lawyer, a business owner, anybody who's kind of looking at AI now who sees the potential in it, what does that pathway look like? What is that trajectory? Is it first understand AI at a high level, then use out of the box tools, then go build your own stuff? Or how would you guide somebody down that road, would you say?
I'm not sure anybody needs to go build their own stuff. I
Yeah.
think that it feels a little daunting. I think if you follow the right learning path, you can definitely do it. But I think the starting point is find one of the model providers. I don't care which one, right? It doesn't make any difference. Um, and just start typing away.
Yeah.
Put information into it and start asking questions. If you're a lawyer and you're worried about security and confidentiality, that is totally valid. So you might want to think about a paid service that will allow you to create a data retention policy that doesn't keep any data, doesn't train on the models, the like. Or you might want to learn how to put a large language model on your computer, right? Do a local large language model that is totally boxed into your computer. It can't go anywhere. You don't have to connect to the internet. It doesn't matter. And you can start doing basic prompting, asking questions, seeing how it comes out. And as you progress down that path, you will quickly see how these systems work, and then you can start layering in pieces. I don't think that this is something that is too difficult for anybody. And one of the biggest ways I always tell people to use it is ask the model to teach you. And you can do that in the way that OpenAI has not come out with, and Google with Gemini, which is like a structured study partner. Um, or you can just do it on your own by doing things like ELI 5, which is, you know, explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. And
Yeah.
why is that important? Because it breaks it down into the very basics, and you can get incredibly far. Now, is there some worry that what you're asking it to teach you, it's just totally made up? Sure, but guess what happens when you start practicing with that? You'll get to the point where it's wrong, and you're like, "Why is it wrong?" And you can go back to the system. You can layer in context from articles, other stuff to help you. But I think fundamentally, it's about trying, and there's many, many tools out there that you can do it at essentially no cost and get really far. As you get further along, you can take courses, you can do more learnings, you can work with people like you to layer in knowledge and skills. But in the beginning, it's just fundamentally go try it. And while it's crazy that, between the various model providers, there's something like a billion people using one of these AI tools every single month.
Yeah.
There's still fundamentally a huge gap in people and that have used this. And that's one of the things that I've come to learn is that there's lots of people that have done it 1 or 2 times. There are not as many people who are consistently using this as part of their workflow, and that's part of what you have to get used to also, which is this isn't I go to a book or I go to Google. It is a step change in how you do things. Oh, I'm going to ask the model, right, how to do this. When you start layering that perspective change, you get a lot more benefit out of it because it's instantaneous almost. It gives you much clearer direction. You're not wasting time looking for things. Now, again, as I said before, there is still a question of is that the right use case, right? Should you use AI for everything? I think the answer is no. But I think in the beginning, if what you're doing is trying to learn how to use these models, that simple change, and I'm going to go to the model to ask questions is an important starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Yeah, so I appreciate it. I have two more questions for you, if that's all right.
Sure.
One is if you have any questions for me, anything from your end to me.
Look, I mean, I think you have shown yourself to be somebody who came into the legal industry without any real background. You don't have legal domain expertise, and you've dove into it. And you can talk about how you go about learning in this space and using the tools you do.
Yeah. I think that, yeah. And it's really similar to stuff that you've already kind of talked about, is just getting your hands dirty, just going to looking at a problem and seeing and figuring out how that problem can be solved with the existing tools. I think as the tools get better, the domain of problems which can be solved just continues to expand and expand. But I think the like when you attack the problem, then the solution starts to present itself. You learn the skill sets that you need to fix the problem, and all that stuff kind of comes out. And then my other question to you was, what question didn't I ask you? What's one thing that we missed today that we didn't touch on?
That's a good question. I I think generally speaking, um, this idea of hallucination is something we haven't talked about. And I think it's, in my opinion, the wrong place to look. It's a little bit of a red herring. And what I mean by that, we hear about this all the time. Some lawyer asked ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever, to give it a legal case that it could cite in a brief. They didn't review that case. It gets into a brief, it gets filed with the court. The court realizes it's fake and they get sanctioned. And what seemed had come out of that is this whole idea of like the models are bad instead of just do your job, like check your sites. But I think the other part of the problem here is that led to a lot of people saying, well, we can't trust the models because they just make stuff up, right? They're parrots. It's just a net token. There's no knowledge behind it. They're not actually doing anything. And I think that's a problem because it misses the fact that they are so helpful in so many other situations. And so hallucination has become kind of the catch-all for why I don't use AI instead of just like one piece of the puzzle that you should understand. It also is important because this idea of hallucination is that it's broken. And what I always say is, no, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's how these models were created. It is supposed to generate new ideas. We are restricting it by giving it context or guidelines, all the rest of it. So if you understand that, look, it's going to generate stuff sometimes that is not quote unquote true, use it in ways that can benefit you that have none of that problems. Brainstorm with it, right? Have it be an sparring partner where you work through an idea. Then there's no hallucination because what it is doing is it is brainstorming with you. That's also a good place to start because there's no real restriction on what you get out of it. You're just talking to somebody else, a model in this case, a computer, about why you might do things. And so I do like to always remind people that focusing on this idea that models hallucinate and therefore you can't use it, I think is just a red herring, is kind of an easy cop out. Instead, focus on, look, there's a real benefit here, and I can make sure I cover myself by doing my part, but don't not use the systems and tools out there because of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think just to add a little bit on that as well, I think that I mean, these LLMs are tools, right? Tools that you can use to solve problems. And they are not as much of they're not as much of a black box as they used to be, and there are things you can do to mitigate hallucinations. There are things you can do to get LLMs to be better tools for whatever your specific use case is, right? So I mean, we could probably go we'd have a whole nother show and talk about context engineering. We could talk about sampling parameters like temperature and top P and top K and how you can manipulate those to mitigate hallucinations. But I mean, you try to achieve something with an LLM, and if it fails the first time, it's not, I don't think it's a reason to kind of throw your hands up and say, this thing doesn't work. I think there's a lot of things that you can do and try in order to get the LLM to work for your specific use case, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I also think we've said it a few times here, but I think like any software, any tool, focus on the problem. Don't just use and build to build. I understand there's a little bit of the FOMO going on right now. Like, I got to use this or I'm going to get left out. That is not what I've been trying to talk about. Yes, I said, look, it compounds over time and you should start to try to use these tools. But I think fundamentally what it comes down to is that everybody in their workflow has some sort of problem that they would like to solve.
Yeah.
And we are in a moment in time where maybe for the first time ever, if you have domain expertise in the problem, before didn't mean you could solve it with software. Now, if you have domain expertise in the problem, you actually might be able to solve it. And that is fundamentally a very different world. And I think it'll mean that you, the end user, can create things or use these models in ways that solve the problem without you having to buy 100 pieces of software. And I think that is an important thing to remember is figure out what the problem is and then go and see if you can get it done yourself.
Yeah. No, completely, completely. Thank you, Sal. Thanks for your time, man. This was great.
I love talking. Anytime anybody wants to find me, you can find me on my Possible Loss Substack. I've got a podcast too. You can also find me on LinkedIn, but I'm always interested in having these conversations. I think it's an important one to have and excited to talk more.
Perfect, man. Thank you.